So up until this point, we've talked a lot about parts of the body and brain communicating with body via spinal cord, those types of things. But how does this actually happen? How does information actually travel to and from the brain? Hint, it's not via texting. So we're going to break down information, neural communication in our next half of this lecture. So first we have to talk about what neurons actually are before we can talk about how they communicate. So this is a neuron. Neurons are basically the cells that send and receive neural messages. So parts of your brain, spinal cord, these are the things that send messages to each other. So let's break down the parts. This top part here, these kind of branch-like purple structures that are not actually purple, just for the diagram, are what we call dendrites. So they're kind of like the neuron's ears. They're going to receive input, they're going to hear information from other neurons that the cell needs to communicate with. So it's going to take in input, it's going to hear information. This giant purple mass in the center of the neuron is called the cell body. And this is where the neuron's nucleus is. Now we're not going to get into the weeds of cell organelles and whatnot that you might have covered in biology, but just know that the cell body contains the nucleus, which is kind of like the cell's control center. So kind of makes like the cell body function like our brains. It's got a little brain inside of it. Not really, but bear with me. So moving off from that, we have this long extension called the axon. So whereas the dendrites are your really short branch-like projections that extend from the cell body, the axon is the singular, long, bendy arm part. And the axon is what transmits the information. Picture the axon like this long line of people playing telephone down the line, taking the message from the dendrites and passing it along down the line to the end. And then at the very end, you have what's called the axon terminal. Terminal is kind of like the neuron's mouth. So it's going to communicate the message to another part of the body or to another neuron. Now, note we're going to get into a lot of anatomy here. So I have underlined terms that are bolded in your book that you should pay closer attention to, whereas others like axon terminal I'm using to label for clarity but are not technically vocab words in your book. Okay, so what is the neuron, the axon terminal mouth, going to talk to? Well, obviously another listening ear of another neuron. So your neurons string together like this, from mouth to ear to mouth to ear, and it keeps passing some sort of message down the line until it gets to where it needs to go. Now, the location of this information transfer, so this kind of gap in between where the mouth is speaking to the ear or where the axon terminal is releasing its information to the next dendrite, is called the synapse. So this is the location of communication between two neurons. Now, in addition to neurons, there are other types of cells in the nervous system. So whereas neurons are the cells that communicate, send and receive neural messages, glial cells, or glia for plural form, are cells that do everything else. So these are nerve cells that support and take care of all other functions besides that actual communication. Again, I don't care that you know these specific details, but in case it's interesting to you, you've got glial cells that are called oligodendrocytes, and these are kind of like little electricians in your brain. So they add insulation to the axon. We're gonna talk about that in a second. It's called myelin, but it's kind of just adding, constructing more parts to the axon. Then you also have your microglia, which is like your brain's dedicated immune system. Since your brain is surrounded by the blood-brain barrier, so it's isolating the brain from the rest of the body. So your brain needs its own kind of immune system to be able to get rid of bad stuff and keep the brain healthy. And then lastly, you have this little thing called an astrocyte. So it's kind of like your security guard in your brain. It's going to form that blood-brain barrier. So it's going to filter substances from your blood vessels so they don't get into your brain. and it's going to regulate the blood flow to the brain. So it's like your security guard. So these are 3 different types of glial cells. Just know that in general, they perform a bunch of secondary functions to kind of keep your neurons up and running okay. Okay, thought question before we get into more communication. Who would win if you had a race through the ocean? Who would win and get to the other side quicker? Is it the man who is running through the water? Or is it the man who is running on stepping stones above the water? Think about that and tell me your answer in a second, but I'm going to give you one other question to respond to. Which game of telephone, so this type of game where you're taking a message and you're saying it, to your friend who tells their friend, etc., down the line, which game of telephone will be more successful, aka more accurately getting the initial message to the last person? Will it be the game with fewer people passing the message, or the game with more people passing the message? So I'm going to pause here. Tell me what you think on these 2 questions.